Hello there, welcome to another lesson on BET series Biologists Explain This. I still remain your biology teacher, Peter Abiodun, and we are continuing our discussion on the nervous system. In lesson 2, we discussed the glial cells, cells that assist neurons in their functioning, and I sent in some questions that you should attempt them and get back to me so that we can work together and prepare effectively and efficiently and adequately for the examinations ahead of you. So we'll be discussing the types of neurons in this lesson. Come along with us and let's enjoy this ride together. Let's look at our learning objectives in this lesson. One, by the end of this lesson, you definitely will be. Now, there are billions of neurons in the body of a typical animal, billions as it were, but they all can be grouped broadly into three different types of neurons. One, you've got the sensory neurons, also known as I said previously, afferent neurons. And these ones, they've got long dendrons and short axons. And we've got the motor neurons with short dendrites. Of course, dendrites are branches of dendrons, and they've got long axons. I said in previous lesson that you would definitely need to know the differences between these two neurons in for the sake of the examination. And thirdly, you've got the relay neurons, okay, which you find between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron in the nervous system. Now, let's begin to talk about the neurons individually, beginning with the sensory neurons. Now, sensory neurons are also known as afferent neurons, and these are nerve cells that transmit impulses. Okay, stimuli, you can use different analogies. Just relax. You just look for the synonym that applies to you that you find convenient that you can easily recall when you have to apply in examination or discussion context. Now, sensory neurons transmit impulses from both external and internal, okay, responses to the central nervous system. Okay, now let me say that again. The sensory neuron or sensory neurons in pluralistic form, they are now cells that transmit information. So if you are looking at something, that's visual stimulus. If you're hearing, that's auditory. If you're smelling, that's olfactory. If you're tasting, that's buccal. And so you have, if you the skin, you've got the cutaneous. All of these are what sensory neurons transmit from. So they transmit impulses from external sources. Okay, sometimes from the internal. Sometimes you are recollecting something, remembering something. So both external and internal stimuli are transmitted to the central nervous system for processing by sensory neurons. So they are the connection between receptors and the CNS. I'm sure that is easy to remember. Okay, again, for the sake of emphasis, sensory neurons are between the receptors and the central nervous system. So they transmit information registered by the receptors and transmit them to the central nervous system where you've got the brain and the spinal cord for processing. And so what they do is to enable the organisms to be able to, to transmit all kinds of, like I said, stimuli of factory, then you have got the cutaneous, the visual, all of these stimuli are transmitted from receptors to the CNS by sensory neuron. And so it's for you to remember this easily because it's easy and convenient to remember this. Remember, they are between the receptors and the central nervous system. There you've got the brain and the spinal cord. Now, still on sensory neurons, I want to discuss or talk about the kind of information, the form in which the information they transmit, the forms they take. Now, this information that are transmitted by sensory neuron, it can either be physical, like when you touch something, for example, okay, and then when you're looking, when you're viewing, that's visual stimuli. Those are physical in nature. You got the chemical stimuli like smell. The sensation of smell is transmitted in the form of chemicals in the atmosphere to person perceiving the smell. So remember, it can be physical or chemical in nature. And in terms of structural design, the structure of the neuron, sensory neurons, they are described as pseudo-unipolar because they've got one axon which splits into two branches. So pseudo means false. And then you can imagine the polar, that's the direction of the sensory neuron. So remember that characteristic, that feature of sensory neurons. Let's turn our attention to motor neurons. Now, we said earlier on in previous lessons introduction that motor neurons are also called efferent neurons. As against them, sensory neurons are referred to as afferent neurons. And motor neurons carry impulses from the central nervous system. Here we've got the brain and the spinal cord towards the effectors. Effectors are to carry out the final response. If you registered a stimulus, okay, no matter the nature, physical or chemical, what kind of response is required. Muscles contract to bring about a response of movement, like withdrawing your hand from a hot object or removing your foot from a sharp object when you stepped on a, on a broken bottle, or nails that is harmful on the ground. Sometimes you need a hormone. I say you're threatened, you are you're fearful, you're afraid. Okay, you need the hormone adrenaline from the adrenal gland. Okay, sometimes you've got internal stimulus, the sugar level is too high, glucose is too high, and then the pancreas being stimulated to secrete the hormone called insulin. So the motor neuron, so once the stimulus is processed in the central nervous system, there is a response that is required for the body to make in response to the stimulus that is being registered by the receptor. So effectors they transmit the impulse from the CNS after processing to the effectors, which can be a muscle or a gland, depending on the kind of stimulus. And then at usually, motor neurons release transmitter molecules. Of course, you can relate with transmitters. Your telecom providers, okay, they've got this mast that tends to help you to transmit the information between you and your family member or friends that you're relating with. So you got to transmit the information. So you've got transmitters that you have. So all media bodies have transmitters that help you to connect with different people in different parts of the world. And so usually at the ends of motor neurons, they release molecules that you refer to as neurotransmitters, and a very common kind of transmitter molecule is called acetylcholine. Okay, it triggers a lot of responses, as we're going to see later. One of the responses triggered by acetylcholine. Now, still on the motor neurons. Motor neurons are located in the part of the CNS known as the brainstem or the spinal cord. Remember, they connect the effectors. And so from the brainstem, they can connect the different parts of the body, the muscles, the glands, and all the various organs that have to respond to a particular stimuli. That's the issue of the location of the motor neurons. And also, it's important to look at the kinds of influences that motor neurons have on the body. And they control movements of different parts. So when muscles contract, for example, muscles bring about movement of that part of the body. And so motor neurons are very effective, very important, very influential in bringing about all kinds of movements. And so they send signals from the spinal cord in the CNS and the brainstem to skeletal and smooth muscles. So again, when we get to muscles, we'll be discussing the different types of muscles, because a skeletal muscle is an example of voluntary muscles, while smooth muscles are involuntary, meaning involuntary means that the brain has no control over them. You've got smooth muscles in the airways, you've got smooth muscles in the walls of your arteries and veins, and skeletal muscles are found in your limbs. They move your arms and your legs respectively. Now we are still on the motor neurons, and we are discussing the fact that you can group motor neurons into two types. Okay, you've got the ones referred to as lower motor neurons because they travel from the spinal cord in the central nervous system to the muscles. That's quite a distance, and so that's what they do. And then you've got the upper motor neurons because they are located in the CNS. They connect the brain and the spinal cord. So that's it's important to understand these two. There are motor neurons that travel far, and there are some that are located within the nervous system. There are kind of stimuli that you need the brain and the spinal cord to work together. Now, you've got the brain controlling voluntary stimuli, things that you can control, like you can decide to sit, you can decide to stand, you can decide to just stay put where you are. But there are some activity, there are some stimuli like heartbeat that you don't have any control over whatsoever. They occur involuntarily without your influence. Okay, and so that's what the spinal cord controls. So the upper motor neurons help to connect these two in the nervous system because there are kinds of stimuli that you need the two of them to work together to coordinate and control. Now we've got another facts about motor neurons, okay, and that is the fact that motor neurons they are characterized as multipolar. Okay, remember we talked about the fact that sensory neurons are referred to as pseudo-unipolar. In contrast to that, motor neurons are multipolar. Why are they described as multipolar? That's because they've got several dendrites projecting from the cell body and the axon. So that's multipolarity that you have in motor neurons, unlike pseudo-unipolarity that you see in the sensory neurons. Let's turn our attention to relay neurons. Now, to relay means to connect. Just remember, just picture in your mind's eye the relay team of your school. Okay, so you've got the first person carry that takes the first leg connecting with the second one, and like to get the person that takes the last leg. So you call all of them, they make up what you call a relay team. Okay, so because they are connected through the baton. So the relay neuron, also called interneuron, also called association neuron, it allows the sensory motor neurons to communicate with each other in the nervous system. And so they connect different neurons within the brain and the spinal cord. And so, in other words, it's easy to picture this. If the sensory neuron is doing its own thing, the motor neurons, how does the motor neuron know what to do? Now, it's not every stimulus that it need the three of the neurons working together. There are simple reflexes and there are complex reflexes. So usually there are reflexes like the knee jack that you don't need the real neuron to mediate in. It's just like that. And you got the complex reflexes, like the one of stepping on a sharp object, touching a hot object, and things like that. Those are complex reflexes in which the three neurons work together. And so we describe interneurons as being multipolar like motor neurons. So they have that similarity. They are multipolar like the what? The motor neurons. So remember this distinction and this similarity and this connection that they have with one another. Now, apart from connecting sensory and motor neurons with each other in the nervous system, sensory neurons also communicate with each other. Now, in this situation or this scenario, when real neurons connect with each other, they enable the brain to be able to complete some kinds of complex functions. Now, when you are learning, for example, in learning, you have to connect concepts and principles. New ideas make sense in the light of the previous things you've learned. Now, if you're learning about a gland, for example, a gland is a cell or any structure that secretes a hormone. Now, if you remember that a gland is first and foremost a cell, then the first thing to recall is, what does a cell look like? Okay, the cell can be viewed like a factory, like a factory where you have a kind of division of labor, where you've got so you want to produce a protein, for example. Now you've got to have a blueprint. So you've got the DNA having the gene for the protein, like insulin or enzymes for digestion, for example. And then when you have got to copy the gene, interpret it, so there's transcription. Then the mRNA you have produced leaves the nucleus and comes to the ribosomes in the cytoplasm to translate the gene code that you have transcribed. And then you've got the rough AR. Okay, the rough AR is supposed to have ribosomes on it, and the ribosomes on it begin to translate, and then when you translate the template that you have brought, what you call genetic code, what you call the codon sequence, you begin to translate them into amino acid sequence of a polypeptide chain of a protein. So remember this, in protein synthesis, you've got the base sequence. So one sequence on the DNA is transcribed into a codon sequence, okay, and then that sequence is translated to mean an amino acid sequence of a polypeptide chain of a protein. That's what you refer to as the codes that you have. So this is what's called central dogma in biochemistry. The central dogma is the sequence on the DNA is used to on the sequence on mRNA, and that sequence on the polypeptide chain of the protein molecule. So you see that the communication between these neurons that you call relay neurons or interneurons is very important in reflexes. Okay, and then of course, now this particular slide is showing us the pictures of the different neurons, what they look like. Like I said in the previous lesson, you've got to know how to compare the structures of the neurons. It can come out your examination, which one has a short dendron and a long axon, which one has a long axon and short dendron, things like that. So the diagram is interesting for you to study and to learn from. So as we round off this lesson, let's look at the following self-assessment questions to review what we've done so far and to help understanding of the basic concepts and principles that we've discussed today. One, you are supposed to be able to state the role of sensory neuron in the nervous system. And number two, in what way, okay, does the role of motor neuron differ from that of the sensory neuron in the nervous system? Number three, be able to describe how the structure of the sensory and motor neuron differ from each other. Number four, describe how motor neurons control movement of skeletal muscles. Number five, what is known as pseudounipolar structure. Then number six, state the role of interneurons in the nervous system. Number seven, how do relay neurons help the activity of the cerebrum? Okay, cerebrum is the center in the brain for learning, consciousness, and habits, and whatever you are able to reason about, that's what the cerebrum helps to do. So I'm trying to ensure that you understand that in case you have not done the brain in your school. Then number eight, and lastly for this lesson, what is known as neurogenesis?